Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
The gavel drops on the first day of testimony, day one of two on Capitol Hill this week for Fed Chair Jay Powell. Congressman Frank Lucas wrapping things up for us there. Several hours of testimony. We brought you live here on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington alongside Kailey Leinz as we get things started a bit later than usual here on the Tuesday edition of Balance of Power. Thank you for joining us on Bloomberg TV, radio, Bloomberg Originals, and on YouTube, where you can find us now by searching Bloomberg Business News Live. Kailey, not an enormous amount of news there, as we heard from the Fed chair, kind of acknowledging the case for lower rates, but making it clear that he's not ready to go there yet.
Yeah, and in that way, the chairman probably doing exactly what he set out to accomplish today, which is not making any news on the trajectory of the Fed's monetary policy path, reiterating he's not in any rush to cut rates. When he was asked directly about the prospects of a rate cut in July, he made it clear he doesn't want to point to any one meeting, didn't necessarily rule it out, but certainly was not suggesting that the data is pointing them in that direction at this point. And interesting, as he was facing many, many questions about tariffs, he said he's expecting to see the impact of tariffs starting to show up in the data this month, the June, July, and August figures.
Yeah, that's for sure. A lot of uncertainty when it comes to tariffs and when it comes to geopolitics, the impact of whether this is a ceasefire or not between Israel and Iran. U.S. involvement this week has really left a lot of pieces up in the air here for policymakers, of course, which is why this has been such a difficult needle to thread for Jay Powell, and he gets to do it all over again tomorrow on the Senate side.
Yes, indeed. And Michael McKee gets to sit through hours of testimony and watch it and join us to analyze it as well again tomorrow, as he is today. He's here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio. So, Mike, as I said, perhaps nothing really new from the chairman. The Fed is still sitting tight until the data suggests otherwise.
It was so not new that he almost repeated word for word the statement he read at the beginning of the press conference last week. The Fed's Hippocratic Oath version is first, do no harm to the markets. And as you mentioned, he didn't do anything that would change people's views of what the Fed is going to do. There have been some questions about July raised by Chris Waller and Mickey Bowman, and he didn't disavow them, but he didn't embrace them either. He went out of his way to say, we don't think we're going to have enough information, but when we do, or if we see inflation come in lower than expected, or if we see unemployment rise, then we'll be looking at changing rates. But he didn't put a time frame on it. And I think that's the most important thing for the folks in the markets. There was a little less politics than I thought today in terms of, do you think the president's policies are good or bad? It was more phrased as, what do you think it's going to do to the economy? And he kept saying over and over again, we don't comment on fiscal policy. We only wait till we see the policy, and then we can figure out what's going to happen.
Let's hear from the chairman, Jay Powell, from a short time ago in testimony on Capitol Hill. Listen.
Policy changes continue to evolve, and their effects on the economy remain uncertain. The effects of tariffs will depend, among other things, on their ultimate level. Expectations of that level, and thus of the related economic effects, reached a peak in April and have since declined. Even so, increases in tariffs this year are likely to push up prices and weigh on economic activity.
He's got July 9th in his head, just like everybody else, knowing that these tariffs could come back around. Donald Trump is very unpredictable on this. You turn him on, you turn him off. But Donald Trump was reaching out to Mr. Powell before the testimony today. Too late, Jay Powell will be in Congress today in order to explain, among other things, why he's refusing to lower the rate. Donald Trump wants 2 or 3 percentage points cut. He says, Mike McKee, we should be at least 2 or 3 points lower, would save the USA $800 billion per year plus. Where did he get that number?
Well, they're looking at what the interest rate cost is at current rates for, I presume he's talking about where the deficit will be once the one big beautiful bill passes, which is his fault, not the Fed's fault. But I think that what's important here to note is that Powell emphasized the fact that a majority on the committee still forecasts 2 rate cuts this year. He's not going to get 2 or 3%, but they will cut rates this year if things develop as they anticipate, just not yet. It's almost as if he was saying, Mr. President, have a little patience, we'll get there.
Well, I don't know how much patience Trump is going to be able to exercise, as he's been pretty impatient on this particular issue for some time now. And the markets, of course, have a patience threshold perhaps of their own, as we also consider the background with which the Fed chair was testifying today, Mike, having this fragile ceasefire in place between Israel and Iran, when just days ago we were very concerned about potential disruption in global energy markets and the inflationary impact that it could have. How does the Fed think about geopolitical risk at this time? What light did Chairman Powell shed on that?
Well, he didn't really shed light on it other than to say pretty much what everybody else says, that this is, he didn't use the word chaos, but it's been chaotic. And it's hard to come up with any particular kind of analysis under these circumstances, because what you thought yesterday is not the same as what you think today. So the Fed is taking it one day at a time like everybody else. If we go through a period where the Middle East calms down, oil prices have been coming down, then that takes away one danger to the economy. But as you mentioned, Joe, we still have the July 9th tariffs coming back. So it's pretty hard to see them doing anything in July, because you've got that and then you've got CPI on the 15th, but they don't get the next PCE report after Fridays until after their meeting. So one inflation report between now and the end of July, the next meeting, it's probably not going to be enough for them.
After one day of testimony, insights from Michael McKee. Great to see you, sir, in Washington, as always. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz as we tiptoe a bit more into that uncertainty. And of course, the NATO summit that's getting underway overseas. Bloomberg's Annmarie Hordern is there for us, Kailey, Bloomberg's chief political correspondent, as they anticipate the imminent arrival here of President Trump. Annmarie, it's good to see you. I wonder how the word of this ceasefire is impacting the conversation in the Netherlands today.
Good afternoon. Well, certainly, Joe, we already heard from Mark Rutte via a private text message. The Secretary General sent President Trump, and if you look at the actual screen grab from the president, it said a minute, and then it looked like he immediately wanted to share it with the world. And he congratulated him on decisive action in the region, and then went on to say that no one could achieve what the president is about to potentially get in terms of a big win, in terms of defense spending when it comes to NATO members of 5%. When it comes to the ceasefire in the region, we did just have a readout from the Iranian president with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. Iran saying that they would like to look at a fair agreement under international frameworks when it comes to the United States. And then in Israel, they do seem to be lifting some wartime measures for society. So it does look like this ceasefire, which this morning was incredibly fragile, and you saw that frustration with the president even using an expletive, talking about these two countries and blaming both of them, but really putting a lot of emphasis on Israel in terms of that vulnerability of the ceasefire and the fragility of it. But the president will be walking into some mixed feelings here at The Hague. You had French President Emmanuel Macron yesterday talking about the fact that the U.S. strikes on Iran were illegal. He went on to say that he agrees with the United States that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon, but doesn't seem to be like he liked the measures the United States took. And then you heard from the new German chancellor, who said that what Israel was doing was the world's, quote, dirty work, and said he really had no problem with the United States and Israel was doing. So I think he'll be met with some mixed results when it comes to what is happening right now in the Middle East.
All right, Annmarie Hordern, Bloomberg's chief political correspondent and host of Bloomberg Surveillance in The Hague, in the Netherlands. Thank you so much. And again, as Joe alluded to, President Trump is expected to touch down in the Netherlands this hour as he gets ready to meet with NATO leaders, having, of course, before he left, discussed with reporters the ceasefire, the fragile ceasefire that has been reached between Israel and Iran, though he was frustrated earlier today with what appeared to be violations of it on both sides, even resorting to using some expletive language. Here was the president before his departure.
I'm really unhappy if Israel's going out this morning because the one rocket that didn't land, that was shot, perhaps by mistake, that didn't land. I'm not happy about that. You know what? We basically have two countries that have been fighting so long and so hard that they don't know what the they're doing. You understand that?
That was the president of the United States before departing to Joint Base Andrews and aboard Air Force One. Well, we have heard from him on Truce Social a number of times since he boarded the plane, suggesting that we are now at a peaceful time, that both sides, Israel and Iran, wanted this ceasefire agreement. The question, of course, is how long can it remain intact? And that's where we turn now to the former chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Congressman Michael McCaul of Texas is joining us live here on Bloomberg TV and radio from Capitol Hill. Sir, we appreciate your time. What will it take to make sure that this ceasefire between Israel and Iran is maintained, is not violated again?
Well, I think the president's done a remarkable job putting pressure on both parties, both Israel and Iran, to stop the fighting that's been going on for so long. I think what happened the other night with our B-2 stealth bombers taking out the 3 nuclear facilities sent a strong message to Iran that we're going to have peace in the region, and that can only be done through strength. I would say also that the response from Iran, they say, was proportional, even though it wasn't. But that's, to me, very indicative that Iran doesn't want to escalate this either. They're saying it's a proportional strike, face-saving measure for the Iranian regime to their people. But they've been hurt dramatically. Both their top leadership, the scientists, the political leaders, and the 3 nuclear sites. I don't think Iran wants to escalate this anymore. And your overture you mentioned to the Saudis just a few minutes ago, I think is very significant step forward.
Congressman, it's good to see you, and I wonder your thoughts to Kailey's point on maintaining this ceasefire, and more specifically, what to do with the highly enriched uranium that is still floating somewhere around Iran that we cannot locate and was apparently moved ahead of U.S. strikes. If we're not going to see weapons inspectors, for instance, in that country, how do we find it? How do we control this?
That's going to be extremely important. It has to be part of the peace agreement. And I'm glad Iran is now wanting to come to the table in good faith, which they were not before. That remaining material is very important. I've been briefed on this strike before it happened as well. It did significant damage, but they can rebuild. We need to make sure they do not rebuild these facilities and that all the enriched uranium is accounted for so they can't build a nuclear bomb. Meanwhile, Israel is inside of Iran, and they're looking at the people of Iran. One of the problems is I have some concerns that as long as the Ayatollah and the oppressive theocracy is in power, it's going to be difficult to maintain that peace. But this president has shown the boldness, I think, in the brilliant military operation to put that kind of pressure necessary to maybe possibly achieve peace as we look at normalization talks between Israel and the rest of the Arab world, that being the Saudis and the other countries to follow.
Well, Congressman, you may have been briefed before this all went down, but many of your Democratic colleagues were not, have been upset about that, as I'm sure you well know. And of course, there are a number of them pushing for a vote on a war powers resolution as a result. This question around congressional notification and authorization. The House Speaker, Mike Johnson, today suggested that the War Powers Act, which has been the law of the land for over 50 years now, is unconstitutional, though the Constitution obviously does say Congress is the only power that can declare war and appropriate funding for the military. What exactly is your reading of the founders' intentions here? Should we be questioning the constitutionality of the War Powers Act?
Well, the War Powers Act was an attempt to reconcile within the Constitution Article 1 that Congress has the power to declare war, which is clear. Article 2, the president is the commander-in-chief, so can conduct limited strikes, like in this case, under the self-defense argument. That has been done since 1973, since war powers. In fact, it's been done prior to that under President Truman, all the way up to modern-day history. The question will be, the War Powers Act started to kick in the day of the strikes. 60 days later, if there is sustained military action, that then does require the Congress to act with either a declaration of war or an authorized use of military force, like what we did after 9/11. So that will be the ongoing discussion, I think, in the Congress. I don't think you're going to see boots on the ground, American boots. I don't think you're going to see sustained military presence by the United States. So perhaps this will take care of itself. But we are obviously in the Congress, we jealously guard our Article 1 powers.
That said, Congressman, if the president was acting amid the executive authority here to protect Americans against an imminent threat, does he need to show Americans the intelligence that would prove that Iran was as close to a nuclear weapon as he is suggesting? Because that would run counter to what we've heard from some others in the intelligence community. And should there be evidence that we close the deal, that the centrifuges, the nuclear facilities have in fact been destroyed, as the president says?
We do have a scheduled classified briefing on that very issue, which will be extremely important for Congress to hear. We operate on the behalf of the American people. That is the Article I authority. Now, when I was chairman of Foreign Affairs, I would get notification from both the Trump and Biden administrations when they use strikes, and under what authorities are they doing this. And many times it could be an AUMF authority or also self-defense, and sometimes just self-defense Article II, which is what they did in this case. They did notify the Congress that they operate under self-defense of the immediate and present danger. Now, I would argue that the fact that they're enrichment at 60%, they could get to 90%, the threat to the Middle East, existentially to the United States, and the track record did pose a threat ultimately to the American people. They have been the largest state sponsor of terror in the region for so many years, since 1979. I hope that this action, though, this military action, will finally bring it to a head where we can finally have peace in the Middle East.
In our final moment with you, Congressman, on intelligence, the president, of course, has criticized the director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard. The ODNI is facing budget cuts. Does this do damage to our intelligence gathering capabilities and operations?
You know, I don't know. I wasn't in the room. I can tell you what I know, and that is that they did have enrichment capabilities to build a nuclear bomb. What they didn't have was a nuclear warhead itself. They were working on that, but they could also buy it from, say, Russia, China, North Korea. It's the nuclear warhead that they need to put the bomb in that then attaches to the ballistic missiles that can then deliver a nuclear warhead to the region. And let's not forget the intercontinental ballistic missiles they've been working on, not to go to the moon as a space program, but to deliver nuclear warheads intercontinental, that being from Iran to the United States. And that is what they were working on, and now we've put it to a temporary halt.
Well, Congressman, it's good to have you with us. We can get into the office of the DNI maybe next time we talk. Michael McCaul, bringing his experience as the former chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee representing Texas, and live from Capitol Hill. We've got much more to follow, including our political panel. They'll be with us next year. Alongside Kailey, Leinz, I'm Joe Mathieu on what is the Tuesday edition of Balance of Power. We're live from Washington with much more ahead. Stay with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. And make sure to subscribe to the Balance of Power podcast. Go to Apple, Spotify, anywhere else you get your podcasts. Find Balance of Power and subscribe. You can listen anytime at our website as well, Bloomberg.com.
President Trump departed Washington earlier today. He is en route to The Hague in the Netherlands, expected to touch down at any moment, really, this hour, of course, for the NATO summit, focusing on issues like defense spending among NATO allies, the war between Ukraine and Russia, but featuring heavily in the conversation we all expect will be the ceasefire agreement, albeit a fragile one, between Israel and Iran that was struck overnight, that the president, of course, has been touting after earlier today expressing some frustration with violations, perceived violations of the ceasefire on both sides. It does seem that it is indeed holding for now, and the president on board of the airplane putting up this post on Truce Social, suggesting both Israel and Iran wanted to stop the war equally. It was my great honor to destroy all nuclear facilities and capability and then stop the war. Of course, we still don't know that all facilities and capability in terms of Iran's nuclear capacity has been destroyed. Verification still very much a question at this hour, though the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, went on Fox News yesterday to frame what the U.S. has accomplished in regard to the Iranian nuclear program this way.
A week ago, Iran was very close to having a nuclear weapon. Now, Iran is incapable of building a nuclear weapon with the equipment they have because we destroyed it. Our hope and our expectation is that they're not going to try to rebuild that program. And I think the president really hit the reset button and said, look, let's actually produce long-term peace for the region. That's always been his goal. I actually think when we look back, we will say the 12-day war was an important reset moment for the entire region.
All right, that was last night, and you fast forward to this morning, and things got pretty chippy on the south lawn of the White House, the driveway, actually, as the president was exiting. You probably heard or seen him drop the F-bomb by now, expressing extreme anger at what appeared to be, at least in his interpretation, violations of the ceasefire from both parties, though he said he was very upset with Israel. By the time he got in the helicopter and was on his way to the NATO summit in the Netherlands, the president was posting about a very different tune here, talking about peace in the Middle East. We assemble our political panel for their take on all of this. He's just about to arrive at the NATO summit in the Netherlands. Bloomberg Politics contributor Jeanne Zaino is with us, senior democracy fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, Republican strategist Rick Davis, partner at Stonecourt Capital, Bloomberg Politics contributor. Great to see you both. Rick, how do you maintain this ceasefire if it doesn't include the president coming outside and dropping an F-bomb every day? How durable is this agreement?
Just one more bomb in the Trump arsenal. Look, I mean, I think that the magic of Donald Trump, if you want to call it anything, is that he will treat his allies just as poorly as his enemies sometimes. And in this case, he went right after Bibi Netanyahu, someone whose alliance he has coveted since the day he was first elected in 2016, and a deep-seated friendship, and of course no love for the Ayatollah. So the fact that he's willing to throw the Prime Minister of Israel under the bus on a violation of the ceasefire indicates that you got to pay attention to the rules that he sets out. And it's not the negotiating style we're used to. It's not going to be replicated anytime soon by future secretaries of state or presidents, but this president can get away with it, and it's actually going to, I think, potentially work out well in this instance, because without that tough talk to both parties, one or the other is going to take advantage, and this is going to be a very difficult peace to keep, and I think it's going to be this kind of peace by a 2x4. Is the only way to get these parties to get to a peace agreement long term.
Well, that raises the next question here, Jeanne. It's one thing for a ceasefire to be maintained and for Israel and Iran to no longer be firing missiles directly at each other. It's something else entirely for Iran to return to the negotiating table on its actual nuclear program and its future, for something, to Rick's point, in terms of a sustainable agreement to be reached and whether that can be brokered with the U.S. Is that still, in your mind, what the president's ultimate objective is here? Or is he going to claim peacemaker on this or deal maker on this, even if he can't claim deal maker on that in the future?
You know, knowing Donald Trump the way we do, I think he would like to be a deal maker on both. And certainly he is really bent on transitioning from war to war maker to peacemaker. And that's his frustration, obviously, this morning. But Rick just used the word, the magic of Donald Trump. And to me, that is the right word, but it's in a different context. It's the magical thinking of this administration. And you heard it in the clip with J.D. Vance. He says, a week ago, Iran was close to nuclear weapons. We haven't been provided evidence of that, but assuming they were, he says now they are incapable of building nuclear weapons because we destroyed their capacity. We haven't seen evidence of that. But assuming even that's correct, he says he is benching all of his hope on the future, on the hope they don't rebuild. And that's where this all falls apart. The objective of the U.S., the administration said, was to destroy long-term their nuclear capacity. And what we have done is incentivized whoever is in power in Iran, not only to build those weapons, but rebuild them if they've been destroyed. They have the know-how and the ability to do both of those things. And that's why this attack does not make sense in the short term. It makes sense in the short term, but in the long term, it does not, as we've given greater incentive, not just to Iran, but the rest of the world. Don't end up like Ukraine. Be like North Korea. Be like Iran. Rebuild those weapons under a great big mountain, because that's the only deterrence you'll have. So J.D. Vance and the president can talk about hope, But there's no leader in the world in Iran who's going to say, let's just give up this ability to make these weapons, because otherwise they know they're open to the attack they saw over the weekend.
Well, the president's carrying with him what he seems to think is momentum here, Rick. He's referring on social media to having made peace abroad. It is time now to turn to other issues, including domestic priorities. But he's first got this NATO summit where he's just now expected to be arriving. And on the way, he decided to post on social media a personal message from the Secretary General of NATO. It looks like screen grabs from a text. It's hard to tell exactly what he's got here, a la reading the Bill Belichick letter out loud. He posts this on Truth with a message from Mark Rutte saying Europe is going to pay in a big way, as they should, and it will be your win. Safe travels. See you at His Majesty's dinner. Mark Rutte. Is that the way to start a summit?
Well, it's certainly a good way to get, some true love from Donald Trump. And we know that everybody since the election 6 months ago has been trying to find ways to communicate effectively with this president. It's not easy. And I think this is a tactic that obviously the Secretary General is employing to get the best.
He didn't think anybody was going to see it, though, Rick. You remember when Donald Trump put Lindsey Graham's cell phone number on TV? Isn't this kind of the same thing?
Yeah, I was there when Donald Trump gave everybody out Lindsey Graham's cell phone number. And frankly, it was the best thing that happened to Lindsey in that whole primary. But nonetheless, I think everyone's finding their place with him. Anybody who sends Donald Trump a note who doesn't believe that it has the chance of showing up on the front page of the New York Times is naive. And I would never call the Secretary General of NATO naive.
Well, as we consider questions around NATO, Jeanne, it's also worth pointing out the president was asked about whether the U.S. would commit to the mutual defense of its NATO allies upon his departure. And he said it depends on your definition of that Article 5 obligation. To quote Article 5 directly, Jeanne, the parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all. And consequently, they agree that if an armed attack occurs, each of them will assist the party or parties so attacked. Is there any real gray area in terms of this definition?
Not in terms of the clear letter of the law or the agreement as it is, but of course, Donald Trump can read it in a different way, and other people have as well. And so I don't think any of our allies in NATO are surprised when he says what he said. And I think, he has been pushing them to increase their commitments to their own defense. And I think there is a positive side for that. He sees that and he has a point in that. But the downside of that is, of course, the United States' ability to have sway over those members simply because of our ability to help defend them is on the losing side of that. So there is a plus side and a downside. And Donald Trump, we've long known, has very strong feelings about NATO and the United States' role in it. And one thing we've learned from this attack in Iran is he doesn't really see the need to go to allies. If we're going to attack, he'd rather we do it on our own. So he's an interventionist. And he's an interventionist who's something like the old style cowboys in the West. He will go it alone. And so I think that's what we're seeing with NATO.
I think he would love to hear you say that. Jeanne, what does Volodymyr Zelensky think about all of this, Rick?
First of all, I would like to add that Israel is our ally in the region, and they were integral to the attack on the nuclear plants in Iran. So it may be alone, but it's with our best trusted ally in the region flying cover for us. Look, Vladimir Zelensky's got to be thrilled. Donald Trump's going to be in a good mood when he shows up in NATO. And Zelensky knows what it's like to have a president from the United States who's in a sour mood. So I got to believe he sees this as a positive in the sense that look at what has been accomplished since Trump's presidency. All these NATO countries have now more than doubled their commitment financially based on GDP to NATO and the defense of Europe, which includes in their definition helping Vladimir Zelensky. So Zelensky looks at Europe and says, wow, I'm getting a significantly better deal now than I had in the previous administration from that. And now I've got to try and work my own magic on Donald Trump. There is an effort in Congress to get additional aid to the Ukrainians sometime soon. And Lindsey Graham will tell you that he's got virtually 100% of the United States Senate willing to support it. And he's got to figure out a way to get something onto the president's desk, taking a path through the House of Representatives. So if I'm Vladimir Zelensky, I see opportunity on the horizon. I know I've got a challenge at home, but abroad it's looking better.
All right, Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, our political panel on this Tuesday. Thank you so much. And up next, we'll turn from geopolitics to happenings here at home, specifically in New York City, where the Democratic mayoral primary is taking place today. We'll take stock of that race next on Bloomberg TV and radio. Joe and myself here on what is a brutal day of heat in the nation's capital, though it's not unique to us today with 100-degree temperatures. It's kind of an East Coast-wide problem all the way up the Amtrak corridor to New York City as well, where we're also in triple-digit temperatures, which could potentially have implications for turnout on a day of voting in New York City. Of course, the Democratic mayoral primary is being held today. And in addition to turnout questions, Joe, as we look at the candidates from a close race, specifically with frontrunners Andrew Cuomo, the former New York governor, and Zohran Mamdani, whether or not weather makes a difference, but also the fact that this ranked choice voting is in play and how that ultimately influences the outcome of who ultimately will be the Democratic candidate.
I think it was 8 rounds last time.
Yeah.
Took 2 weeks to figure out who the winner was, and we could be in for something like that on this primary day with, yes, we're triple digits, 102 degrees right now in New York City with big questions about turnout. Incidentally, it's 70 degrees in The Hague right now where President Trump has just arrived. We want to keep tabs on his trip to the NATO summit, as we were just showing our viewers on Bloomberg TV, a shot of Air Force One just touching down. But we do want to focus on New York City politics, which is something we don't always get a chance to do. And on this primary day, it's a treat to bring in Matt Taglia, Senior Director for Emerson College Polling. We go to my alma mater in this case. Kailey, to find out what's happening here, because the numbers are pretty fascinating. Matt, before we get to your research, welcome to Bloomberg TV and radio. Are we making too much about the weather here? Could this depress turnout and impact the results, maybe work against an Andrew Cuomo in this case?
Yeah, I think anything is possible, certainly, but I tend to believe that if folks want to vote, they're going to end up voting. So I wouldn't put too much stock into the weather today, but it could certainly affect turnout just on the margins.
Okay, well, when we consider those who New Yorkers may feel passionate about turning out for, your latest primary poll leading up to the primary today found that there was more support for Cuomo at 35%, with Mamdani at 32%. But in ranked choice voting, a simulation over 8 rounds, it's actually Mamdani who was in the lead, 52-48 for Cuomo. So how should we be considering that dynamic as we await these results coming in, knowing that if no one gets over 50%, this is going into more rounds?
Yeah, and I do expect this to go into more rounds past the first round, certainly. We had 8 rounds in our polling. As you said, Cuomo at 35 in the initial ballot, Mamdani at 32. And, when we get to that 7th round, we see that Cuomo has a slight lead at 41, Mamdani at 39, and then Lander at 20%. So that Lander vote is really what determines the final round. And in this case, we find that Mamdani benefits the most there. He gets to 52% with Cuomo at 48.
Wow. I'm compelled by this idea, and this has a lot to do, I guess, with New York politics more than anything, that today may not actually be conclusive at all. When we consider what could happen, Matt, Cuomo and Mamdani could still choose to run as independents or with a third party, setting up the potential for a 4-way race with Eric Adams. How likely is that to happen?
Well, I don't want to speak for the campaigns and the individuals and what their intentions are, but it does seem like we are set up for a potential messy situation in the general election. I think, it seems likely that Cuomo wants to run regardless. I'm not sure about Mamdani, but, I regardless of what we see tonight, I think that once we do get into that ranked choice, we're going to see pretty close election results here. So, I really don't think that there's going to be an overwhelming victory for one or the other.
Well, when we consider the factors that ultimately may determine this outcome, in terms of issues in particular, and what these various candidates, not just, of course, the frontrunners, but all 11 candidates in this primary trying to differentiate themselves on, what appears to be resonating the most with New York City voters?
Well, I think that housing is probably the top issue right now for New York voters. The Mamdani campaign has really taken that and run with it. I think that's why we've seen his campaign have such a trajectory. I mean, in February, when we first started polling the race, Mamdani was at 1 or 2%, and now he's at 32% in that initial vote. So, I think it's clear that that message has been breaking through. I don't know that Cuomo's messaging on that has broken through as much. He's sort of stayed around this 35% mark throughout the election. But I think that is top of mind for voters right now.
Matt Taglia, the idea of ranked choice voting is still somewhat foreign to a good number of our viewers and listeners. Does it change your job as a pollster when it comes to predicting the outcome of these races?
Yeah, it absolutely does. For one, when we conduct this poll, we try to emulate the New York ballot as closely as we can. And so we ask votes for their top 5 choices, eliminating whoever their previous choice was. And so when we get that data back, it's a little bit of a mess, frankly, but we have ways of simulating exactly what New York will do when they count these ballots, when they tabulate these ranked choice tabulations. And so there is a bit more work that goes into it. And as far as interpreting the results, that's tough because, as you see, we have to go through 8 rounds in order to get to a majority winner. And we have to consider each and every single candidate and where their vote is going to go. So in this case, though, I think it's most helpful to look at these final rounds where we have Lander around 20% in the second to last, and how that vote ends up splitting, which is about 2 to 1 in our polling for Mamdani versus Cuomo.
Well, I also wonder how financing and funding of these campaigns in a ranked choice system factors in. And I should note on funding that Michael R. Bloomberg, the founder and majority owner of Bloomberg LP, which is the parent company of this network, has contributed to a PAC supporting Andrew Cuomo. He has endorsed him. But how should we be considering the money factor in this race in particular?
I think that the money factor is certainly important, but I think there's also something to be said for grassroots campaigns and energy on the ground. That's something that money can't necessarily capture. Money absolutely matters, certainly, but there's that grassroots element. There's a strategic element here. As we said, with ranked choice voting, this is very different from a typical primary or typical general election. You're ultimately going to be dependent upon folks who aren't casting a ballot for you in the first place, right? So you want to make sure that you're the second or third or fourth or fifth choice for those folks as well. So there's a lot to it. There are a lot of elements at play here, and funding, again, very important, but strategy and a strong ground game, I think, are what really, really make the difference here.
All right, Matt Taglia, we appreciate it. He's Senior Director for Emerson College Polling, joining us here in Balance of Power on this New York Democratic Mayoral Primary Day. We appreciate it so much. And as we watch what's happening in New York, we are also watching the ground in The Hague, Netherlands, where Air Force One has just landed. We're waiting for President Trump to emerge from the aircraft at any time for the NATO summit, of course, having been busy while on board with a number of Truce social posts, many of them pertaining to the ceasefire agreement that was reached between Israel and Iran overnight, but also a true social post that suggested now that peace has been made abroad, the job needs to be finished here at home. The president calling on Republicans to pass the great big beautiful bill, as we're seeing now on Bloomberg Originals, on YouTube, and on Bloomberg TV. President Trump emerging from Air Force One, appearing to put on a hat that I think says USA on it, Joe, as he gets ready to descend the stairs.
That was an interesting move. He pointed to the folks at the bottom of the stairs, put the white USA cap on, and is now making his way down. Suit jacket buttoned up as he arrives at the NATO summit, Kailey, with some momentum behind him, having started his morning very upset on the South Lawn of the White House, dropping an F-bomb to reporters, accusing both Israel and Iran of violating a ceasefire agreement that he announced last night. He's being greeted on the runway right now with what will be a celebratory dinner. It's been described as a social dinner with world leaders, NATO leaders. Kailey, we've already seen the message from Mark Rutte, NATO Secretary General. I'm not sure he realized Donald Trump was going to post it on social media, but a pretty flattering welcome note.
Yeah, posting a private communication in full on Truce Social, in which Rutte congratulated him not only on brokering this ceasefire agreement between Iran and Israel, but also on his efforts to push for more defense spending from NATO countries. Mark Rutte, in his message to Trump, said it was difficult, but they've gotten everyone on board with this new 5% quota. Of course, that is expected to be a subject of conversation, as we've seen President Trump finishing shaking hands, now getting into the beast, and he will proceed on with his scheduled activities for today. So for more on this, we turn to Laura Davison, who's Bloomberg's Washington Deputy Bureau Chief. So Laura, obviously the president, to Joe's point, coming into this summit with a lot to celebrate perhaps in his mind in terms of what he's accomplished in the Middle East, but how should we expect the focus of this meeting to be more so on a different conflict, Ukraine and Russia, and what does he want to do with it there?
This is interesting because Trump has really not spent much time thinking about Ukraine and Russia in the past week. It has totally fallen off the headlines as Iran and Israel have come to the forefront. But with that, at least conflict seeming to be on pause for now, this really shifts the narrative here. Trump, of course, famously has been very resistant. He sort of has said, he wants Ukraine and Russia to continue to fight it out. Of course, NATO is very interested in making sure that Ukraine is supported, and this is going to have Trump at odds with a lot of the foreign leaders there.
This is being framed, or at least it was before the events of the past couple of days, Laura, as a celebration of Donald Trump's victory, if you will, to get NATO members to spend more on defense. 5% is the new magic number. Spain might not see it that way, but that will essentially be the headline out of this conference, right? To what extent will members be able to make good on this new target?
That remains to be seen. There's several countries who have pushed back on this. 5% is a big number. It has been roughly half that for many years, and countries even still failed to meet that number. So this is going to be a difficult thing, but this is also something that Trump has really hammered allies on for years and said, look, if you don't pay up, then we may not come to your defense. This whole Article 5 issue has been a key issue going forward, and there'll be some meetings that'll be very important to watch, particularly the one with Zelensky. He was supposed to meet with Zelensky at the G7 last week in Canada, had to come back to Washington and miss that meeting. So some of the talks there will kind of give a sense of kind of how Trump is feeling towards Ukraine and what that might mean for the conflict going forward.
And in our final minute, Laura, on board Air Force One, as I was mentioning earlier, the president did seem to keep his eyes on what's going to be happening here in Washington in his absence as the Senate tries to get out its final package of the one big, beautiful bill. What do we need to know about what is getting taken in or taken out and included at this point?
So there's still some key things they haven't resolved. There's no deal on SALT. They still haven't figured out exactly the contours of the Medicaid provision. John Thune, the head of the Senate Republicans, says he wants to vote, potentially sometime Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and it would go to the House for them to get it done. But there's a lot that they need to do. Trump has warned in a Truth Social post they should take no vacations until they get it done. And I anticipate that Republican leaders will heed that advice.
No days off. You said Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So this is a working weekend in Washington.
It is.
Okay.
I'm available for any hits you need.
This will be better for it. Laura Davison, thank you so much. Our Deputy Bureau Chief here in Washington, setting the table for what could be a vote that bumps into the weekend. We'll see about that, and we're going to talk a lot more about it in the late edition of Balance of Power. I'll be back along with Kailey Leinz at 5 p.m. Eastern Time as we track the president's steps at the NATO summit in the Netherlands, and we track the bill, the big, beautiful bill that's moving its way through Congress. This is Bloomberg. Make sure to subscribe to the Balance of Power podcast. Go to Spotify or Apple, wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribe. Watch us live on YouTube or listen anytime at our website, Bloomberg.com.